All right, so I feel like that cleanup batter in baseball that kind of has to just hit whatever there's left to look at. And we've already heard the domestic and a good foreign policy analysis, so I'm not going to confine myself to either and try to go on both. So you'll have to keep me honest in terms of my time. Hopefully I'll talk quick enough I can make all the information out there. It's always dangerous when you get into a room like this and I see a bunch of friends and journalists who seem like they would know more than me anyways, and I'm afraid of saying things that I tend to do, which is very inflammatory types of things. But let me just say, when I was watching the Turkish elections, the first thing I was struck by was how little attention America paid to it. It seemed that even without the elections, we had already written the narrative. And I think that the Economist article and a lot of the other international press had already done the same thing. The elections were not interesting to watch. It doesn't really matter. The AKP is going to win. That was the narrative, and therefore, I mean, this is a typical, in this town, it's a game in some ways. It's about lowering expectations. So the fact that the AKP won its third consecutive term and has increased its vote share each time in the popular mandate, but actually in parliamentary process has actually gone down. It had 2/3 originally, it had over the number now, and now it's got 325 seats. I mean, that's actually a really interesting story. I mean, that is democracy in action. And I think from an American point of view, parliamentary democracies are not very well understood. We understand a great man. We understand Erdogan as a leader, but we don't actually understand the dynamics at play. Luckily, Turkey is a relatively easy place to understand under the AKP. There is one man, there is one leader. He is the person that we go to. And I think in the past, it was always interesting because the political leaders were interesting. They made nice statements, but actually at the end of the day, they were not the only people we talked to. You know, my experience in the embassy in Ankara was that you would always keep tabs on both the parliamentarian side of things, but you also made sure you went to the General Chief of Staff. You know, I think that time is over now. It's very clear to me that with these 3 election wins, clearly democratization, in whatever term you want to use that, in terms of the electoral success of the AKP, have put to rest once and for all that question of who do we talk to. So there should be no confusion in Washington, there should be no confusion in Brussels or any capital who the person to talk to is, and that is clearly the Prime Minister. Now, the question of a national will, those of you that study Turkey and those who understand Turkish as well, this national will is not a new thing, right? I've heard this before from Menderes, I've heard this from Özal, and now we're hearing it again. It's something that permeates Turkish political culture and the idea of interpreting it. And as Matt just rightly referenced, that's something that's not unique to Turkey. President Bush claimed the mandate after his win in 2004. And we hear it after every president. It doesn't matter what your percentage is, you claim the popular mandate. But in the Turkish case, it's particularly interesting. There were 15 parties that competed in this election. And really, all the parties that made it into the parliament, as Gülnur told us, can actually claim victory. I mean, that's a really interesting scenario. In America, you have a winner and a loser. In Turkey, everybody's a winner. So I don't think that the Prime Minister was disingenuous when he said the winner of this election is Turkey. Because in some ways, the AKP didn't get quite as much as they might have liked. They didn't cross the 330 threshold. The MHP didn't get decimated because of its sex scandals. The CHP improved on its showing the last time around with a new leader. And the Kurdish party made it into parliament, and there were 3 socialists thrown in the mix. So, I mean, this is a really, from an outside point of view, and as a friend of Turkey, you know, all the hand-wringing and all the kind of, oh, it's boring, we don't want to follow it, or the despair that I hear among some of my friends in Washington seems to be misplaced. You can certainly say that the Prime Minister's behavior in the election in terms of campaigning was very divisive in many ways. What he said about the Kurds, what he said about Alevis and kind of underhanded ways at the opposition, and what the opposition said was divisive in a lot of different ways. I heard a lot of anti-Israel, I heard a lot of anti-West. I wasn't very happy, particularly as a friend of Turkey, but also as a friend of the United States that wants to see closer U.S.-Turkish relations. But that's campaigning. I mean, we see the same thing when I watched the Republican primary debate. That was pretty nasty as well. I mean, they said far nastier things about Obama than Erdogan could ever hope to say about my president. So I think it's important to put that in context. The real question is, how do we go, what does it look like moving forward? It seems to me that there is clearly a mandate to write a new social contract. I think as Gülnur was talking about this in terms of who's going to write the first civilian constitution for Turkey. And are they going to create a system in which it's safe and fair to go back and forth between elections? You know, I come from a place, I grew up in Japan. Japan is very used to a one-party system. In fact, all the elections don't really matter. It's what happens inside of the factions. So it was first the Liberal Democrats of Japan, now it's the Democratic Party of Japan. In many ways, that's what the AKP has become in some ways. The question is, do they want to continue on that path, or do they want to find a way to make kind of a grand bargain? To me, it seems most likely that if the CHP is able to its rhetoric is able to transform itself, and it's able to rid itself of the religiously fanatic Kemalists, because I do agree that there's a more dogmatic belief in religion among the Kemalists than there is among devout Muslim friends that I have in the AKP. that is actually the most likely, to me that seems like the best outcome. Now it may not be the most likely outcome. I think unfortunately, given the realities on the ground in Turkey, and given this feeling of kind of, I'm a great man, I have to show to my constituencies that I can do this, and even the fact that the campaign itself, I mean, think about what the campaign was about. The campaign was about the future of Turkey. You know, the picture of seeing Prime Minister Erdogan and seeing 2023 was not a very subtle hint to me. You know, that's 12 years away. What is he asking for? He's asking for 5 years as Prime Minister, and then he's asking him to become the President. So this idea of the quote-unquote presidency or imperial presidency, as I might put it, is a dangerous one. It's a very difficult one to understand. Turkey has a presidential system. It has a parliamentary system, but it also has a president. So if there's going to be a change and there's a way to change the constitution in such a way that all of the diversity of Turkey, that is its strength. I think one of the unique features about Turkey is it's one of those countries in the region that needs to accept the fact that diversity and pluralism is its strength and not a weakness. To be a citizen of Turkey does not mean you have to be ethnically Turkish. You know, there are more Albanians in Turkey, there are more Bosnians in Turkey. I mean, my professor Davutoglu can give you a list of every country in the world that seems to have more people in Turkey than outside of Turkey. And so, what does it mean to be Turkish? And I think that's the point that Gulnur was raising. I think that's going to be a crucial one. And I think that given that the AKP has won, they are in the position to be magnanimous and to look out and to be able to bring in the other parties. They won more than half of the vote. This is probably the most representative parliament we've ever seen, because even though the 10% threshold was very high and it creates some very strange things like the first term of the AKP, this time around the Turkish citizens showed a real amazing ability to be strategic in their thinking. These other 11 parties that didn't make it into parliament are negligible. And in some ways, they should go ahead and close up shop and focus on these main opposition groups that are out there. And I think the big question is, can the anti-AKP or opposition forces come up with a coherent message? The CHP tried, but they are restricted by their own identity and their own dogmatic beliefs. Is there a way to have a non-conservative Muslim but a center-right party in Turkey that will take into consideration the diversity of Turkey's ethnic groups, etc.? And so the question is, will they be able to come together? And a lot of this depends on how the AKP reacts. And the signs that we've seen are good thus far in terms of the Prime Minister's words. But as my colleagues have pointed out, words don't equal action. And the question will become, how does that look to the future? Very briefly on the foreign policy side of things, basically, what's happening in the region has caught Turkey by surprise, just like everybody else. But it, in my mind, stands to gain the most, because a stable Middle East, a more democratic Middle East, does not benefit Iran, it does not benefit Israel, it benefits Turkey first and foremost. Turkey is the kind of the major engine of this region in terms of economically speaking. It's the largest economy in the region, it's the fastest growing economy in the region, it's the most stable democracy in the region that is indigenous, and you can have discussions among my Israeli friends and Turks about this. But I think the Turks in many ways are seen by the Arab world as kind of like us because of the Muslim character, where Israel is kind of seen as being an outpost of the West in some ways. And I think that Turkey, as it changes its kind of character, in many ways, I don't think there's been a change in what Turkey is. It's about what Turkey represents to the rest of the world. The government they currently have is probably more representative of Turkey than at any time of its history. And so I think the idea that the Prime Minister has this kind of, for lack of an English word, delikanlı approach to things, a very kind of, I'm from the Bronx of New York and I'm going to make sure that you know that I am the man in this room. When I walk in, everybody stands to attention. I mean, this approach is really one of a global leader, no longer simply a national leader. He craves it. He seems to really revel in this. He's the most popular leader in the Arab world right now. And I think how he uses that leverage will be very interesting to watch. I think if he wants to continue to have petty fights with Israel, I think he can continue to do that, and he can certainly hurt Israel. I think that what we're going to see in September in terms of this Palestinian vote, Turkey's in the forefront, it seems. If this Gaza flotilla thing continues, he'll win short-term votes. But if he wants to be a global leader, then part of being a leader and part of leadership is bringing these divisive factions together. It's being able to find solutions to conflict, not creating new conflicts that you then have to come up with new policies about. And so I think in Syria and in Libya, like Matt was talking about, Turkey has been on the forefront of some of these things, but sometimes they seem to be reactive instead of proactive. And something I've always respected about Turkish foreign policy is they seemingly look towards the future, and having a deep understanding from their past of what it's like to be in this region, they've been able to approach that with a new approach of strategic depth. I would argue it's now time for democratic depth for Turkey, where they need to be able to look within themselves to find the solutions to that problem and to model this behavior and to be an inspiration that they so desperately claim to be.